The Age of Revolution, 1789 to 1848, by Eric Hobsbawm, book review. So this is a history book, but it's a classic history book as these things go. It was originally published in 1962, but is still in print nowadays. You can still find it at bookstores nowadays. The author, Eric Hobsbawm, is an interesting guy. You can Google his name, go to his Wikipedia page. He was, according to Wikipedia, originally born in Egypt. Jewish family, I think, immigrated to Britain during the 1930s as kind of refugees from the fascism that was going on at the time. And was famous in Britain, became famous in Britain not only as a celebrated historian, but he was also a political figure. He was a die-hard Marxist up until the end of his life. He died in 2012. Again, according to Wikipedia, he was notable for not leaving the Communist Party during the 1956 Soviet invasion of Hungary, although he did sign his name on a letter protesting that. Again, all this is in the Wikipedia page. So a notable Marxist, but again, according to Wikipedia, his historical analysis is widely respected by people across the political spectrum. He's famous for writing a trilogy of books about the 19th century, which is the Age of Revolution, 1789 to 1848, the Age of Capital, 1848 to 1875, and the Age of Empire, 1875 to 1914. Now this takes a long view of the 19th century, saying that the 19th century really started with the French Revolution in 1789, and it really finished with World War I in 1914. According to Wikipedia, this is known as the long 19th century. My university classes, I was a history major back at university, also classified the 19th century along those lines. So the course on modern Europe started with 1789 and finished with 1914. So I believe this is somewhat of a common classification among historians. And then also he published kind of a sequel to his trilogy, which is The Age of Extremes, which is 1914 to 1991, which is obviously the 20th century. But his primary area of expertise is the 19th century. Now, I believe, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, I believe that these books are more famous in Britain than they are in the United States. I'm an American myself, but I've been living abroad teaching English for the past 20 years or so. And I see these books, I've seen these books pop up at international bookstores. For example, I first found them when I was living in Japan. At the English section of Japanese bookstores, which I believe they were stocked not for the benefit of the Japanese themselves, but for the expatriates, which of course is not only Americans, but, you know, British, Australian, New Zealand, etc. And I've also seen these books figure prominently in bookstores in Southeast Asia, in Phnom Penh, etc. I don't remember seeing them so much in American bookstores back home. Again, somebody correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe I was just going to the wrong bookstores. Eric Hobsbawm seems to pop up more in conversation with British people than it does with American people. And again, maybe I was just hanging out with the wrong crowd in America. Let me know if I'm getting this wrong, but my general impression is that these books are more famous back in Britain or among British people. So I picked up The Age of Revolution, 1789 to 1848, back when I was living in Japan, and I struggled through it. I've really been interested in the general period. I was really interested in the period of 1789 to 1848, in the revolutions going on which were shaking Europe at the time, the general upheaval, the idealism. I was attracted to all of this. So I was interested in the subject matter, but I found Eric Hobsbawm's book to be difficult reading. There are a couple of reasons. One is I'm mostly interested in narrative history. Like, I like historians or history writers who will make history into some sort of narrative or some sort of story, which Eric Hobsbawm does not do. He's much more interested in analyzing the general trends, going through the statistics, teasing out the cause and effect. He's not so interested in writing about the biographies of interesting people or talking about the stories of interesting people. And also, he just writes in a very academic tone, which was hard going for me. I'm used to picking up more armchair histories, more popular histories, things that are easier to read. So I struggled through this book a lot, and I got through it. I mean, it wasn't like it was impossible to read. It wasn't like I couldn't understand what he was writing about. It was just that his writing style was very academic, and it caused me to have to read very slow and kind of take it in. And it exhausted me to a certain extent so that I could only read it in small doses at a time. I'll read a typical sample, and you can maybe judge for yourself the writing style. This comes from page 369. I'm completely pulling this out of context, so take that in mind. But this is what the writing style reads like. Quote, "When we come to analyze the social and political structures of the world in the 1840s, however, we leave the world of superlatives for that of modest qualified statements. The bulk of the world's inhabitants continued to be peasants as before, though there were a few areas, notably Britain, where agriculture was already the occupation of a small minority, and the urban population already on the verge of exceeding the rural, as it did for the first time in the census of 1851. There were proportionally fewer slaves, for the international slave trade had been officially abolished in 1815, and actually slavery in the British colonies in 1834, and in the liberated Spanish and French ones in and after the French Revolution. However, while the West Indies were now, with some non-British exceptions, an area of legally free agriculture, numerically, slavery continued to expand in its two great remaining strongholds, Brazil and the southern USA, stimulated by the very progress of industry and commerce, which opposed all restraints of goods and person, and official prohibition made the slave trade more lucrative." That's actually only half the paragraph. It goes on like that for equal length for the full paragraph, but you get the idea. And I know I took that out of context. It does somewhat make more sense in context, but imagine a whole book written in that tone, and maybe you can understand why I could only take it in small doses and why it took me a long time to read through this book. Or maybe you can't. Maybe you're smarter than me, and this book is ideal for you. But for me, I found that as I was struggling to make sense of all this dense information, my mind kept wandering. I could only make it through the book in small doses. Hobsbawm in this book covers the revolutionary period. There's the revolutions of 1789, 1830, and 1848. But he never actually tells you what happens in these revolutions. In other words, it's not a narrative of the barricades. Instead, he's analyzing the conditions leading up to the revolutions and also the conditions resulting from them, instead of more of an analysis of the revolutions themselves, which was disappointing to someone like me. He was actually hoping for more stories about what was actually happening during the revolution. But I did learn a lot of really interesting things about from this book, even though I really struggled with it. Hobsbawm has taken the 60-year period of history when all of Europe was consumed between the struggle between absolutism and, kings on the one hand, and liberty on the other hand. In fact, I think the tone of the book can be summarized by a quote that he gives on page 138 from a guy named Ludwig Born. Quote, "Liberty, that nightingale with the voice of a giant, rouses the most profound sleepers. How is it possible to think of anything today except to fight for or against freedom? Those who cannot love humanity can still be great as tyrants, but how can one be indifferent?" And this is really the tone of the book, that everything during this period, everyone during this period, and all of the different facets of art and literature and music was really wrapped up in this struggle, either between those who supported the absolutism during this period or those who supported the new Republican revolutions. Now, what's also interesting about this book is there are a lot more revolutions in this period than I realized. I mean, I think everyone who's interested in history knows about 1789, they know about 1830, and they know about 1848, but to this broad picture, Hobsbawm talks about other waves of revolutions which I didn't even know about. He talks about there was also a wave of uprisings and revolutions which took place largely in the Mediterranean during the period between 1820 and 1824. Hobsbawm also talks about how the European revolutionaries during this period were engaged in their local revolutions, but they saw each local revolution as being connected to a broad struggle against absolutism. And the dream during this period, which is forgotten nowadays, but during this period, people dreamed of a single unified republic. I guess in much the same way that in a later generation, people would dream of a single unified communist state. During the Republican revolutions, they were dreaming of a single unified republic. And Hobsbawm compares the struggle against absolutism in the 19th century to maybe the unified struggle against fascism in the 1930s and 1940s. And in fact, he compares the Greek Revolution in the 1920s to the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s. So during the Greek Revolution in the 1920s, which was something I really didn't even know about before, but he says it attracted Republican idealists from all over Europe who came to Greece to fight in the 1820s, similarly to the way that the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s would attract liberals and socialists from all over Europe to fight in Spain in the 1930s. And not only that, he says actually there was another Spanish Civil War that took place in the 1820s, Spanish Civil War of 1820 to 1823, which, like the Spanish War in the 1930s, Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, also attracted an international brigade to support the Spanish liberals in their fight against reactionary clericals in the 1820s. But it's not just the political revolutions that Eric Hobsbawm is interested in. He examines the dual industrial and political revolutions and their impact on each other. For example, the political revolutions abolished feudalism and serfdom. And this was done partly for idealistic reasons, but it also had the effect of flooding the cities with cheap labor, which the factory owners needed. So he makes a case that, yes, the revolutions abolishing serfdom and feudalism was done for ideological reasons, but that ideology was also shaped by the necessity of the Industrial Revolutions, or in other words, the fact that the factory owners needed all this cheap labor made the Republican ideology acceptable during this period. He also talks about the liberal attitude during this period, which idealized a laissez-faire state. And he comments on some of the paradoxes of the age. For example, the liberal opinion was against slavery, and it eventually eliminated the slave trade in Europe. Didn't get rid of slavery completely, and slavery remained in Brazil and the southern United States, but it got rid of the slave trade. But that same liberal opinion put a high value on free trade. Free trade was supposed to solve all of society's ills. There were supposed to be no barriers between nations. Everyone was supposed to trade freely. But that free trade meant that in the nations where slavery remained, Brazil and the southern US, it guaranteed that slavery was going to be profitable because they were able to do free trade with Europe, which meant that it was going to be all that more difficult to get rid of slavery in those areas where it remained profitable. Also talks about how the liberal reforms ended up creating a bureaucracy in Britain which by 1840 was 4 times as great as the bureaucracy in autocratic Russia. And this was in liberal Britain. So he's pointing out a lot of the paradoxes and contradictions of the age. It was really interesting. Hobsbawm also charts the birth of capitalism. Now, I've talked about this in previous videos, but capitalism, as we know it today, is not the same as just buying and selling stuff. That's mercantilism. That goes way back. But capitalism, as these huge corporations, does find its birth during this period. And Hobsbawm charts that birth. There were early disasters and recessions as capitalism was finding its footing. And Hobsbawm also describes how it goes from being this completely new economic system, but it had a lot of proponents who quickly established it as the economic system. Like, this is the way human society has always been organized and always will be organized. And how these proponents were able to very quickly establish it that way in society. The book also has chapters on almost every imaginable facet of society. It's got chapters on war, on peace, on land, on religion, on secular ideology, on the arts, and on sciences. And they're all interesting in their own ways. For example, in the chapter on science, Hobsbawm explores the early conflict between religion and science. In the chapter on arts, Hobsbawm claims that almost all art of any lasting value from this period was politically motivated. And he contrasts this with the postmodern view that true art must be separated from politics. Hobsbawm talks about art like Mozart's The Magic Flute, to Beethoven's Eroica, to the French painters such as Delacroix and David, to the romantic and revolutionary novelists of this period, and makes the case that all the great art of this period was tied up to the political events of the day. And again, the major political events being the struggle between absolutism and the Republican idealisms, Republican revolutions. I found this all fascinating, but again, the style of the prose was really tough going for me. I had to take this book in small doses. Took me forever to wade through it. For the reader who's willing to struggle through this, there is so much fascinating stuff in this book, but you do have to be willing to struggle through it. An addendum, there is so much untranslated French quotations in this book. Hobsbawm, of course, being an educated person writing in the early 1960s, I'm sure he's assuming that every educated person can read French. But boy, is that not true nowadays. It certainly was not true for me, and so this was a constant annoyance, encountering all these untranslated French quotations, which I either had to guess at the meaning of or just skip through. So that's my review of The Age of Revolution. As a bit of an addendum to this review, I'll add that since I've read this book, I've encountered a few people who have spoken very highly of the whole trilogy. A Scottish friend of mine, somebody who wasn't even a history major. You know, I was a history major back at school. This Scottish friend of mine was a geography major and talked about how this was like the only really history book he really got into. And that kind of got me a little bit, because I thought, here's somebody who doesn't even read history, who found this book really interesting. So I thought, if he could do it, I'm going to go back to this trilogy one of these days, and I'm going to read the whole thing. And so the last time I was in Phnom Penh, I picked up The Age of Capital, the second book in this trilogy, and I got about 10 pages into it, and then I again gave it up for the same reasons. It was just very slow going for me. I had to struggle so much to stay focused on it. That being said, I obviously still have this book in my collection, and I still have ambitions of one day finally finishing this trilogy. So I don't know, stay tuned. Maybe one of these days I will finally come back and read the next book in this trilogy, and then maybe the next book after that, and I don't know. It remains my ambition to finally tackle the whole trilogy, and maybe even the sequel book that came after. But for now, all I've got done is The Age of Revolution.